Hi everyone, welcome back to Lecture 9F of Useful Genetics, where we're going to start thinking about inbreeding. We'll talk about what inbreeding is, we'll calculate coefficients of inbreeding, and we'll consider the effects of inbreeding on the likelihood of being homozygous for a harmful allele. So inbreeding raises similar issues for most plants and animals, including us. In this lecture and the next, we'll talk about the importance of homozygosity for recessive alleles. In Lecture 9H, we'll talk about a strong advantage of homozygosity and why it's used to create strains with reproducible genotypes and phenotypes. And in Lecture 9I, we'll talk about how inbreeding reduces the reserves of genetic variation and the consequences of this for ecology and conservation programs. Here's a slide from Module 7 showing relatedness of different kinds of relatives. And we'll be particularly focusing in our discussion of inbreeding on partly on full siblings and mostly on cousins. Full siblings are expected to have 50% of their alleles in common. Cousins, 12.5%. And a term that will come up is that of identity by descent. And this refers to alleles that are common because they were inherited from the same common ancestor. And I should point out that these relatedness values are predictions, because until recently it was not possible to measure actual relatedness. Now it is possible to measure actual relatedness. You've seen this diagram before. It shows the actual identity by descent between two siblings. And what I want to again point out is the light blue segments are places where they both got the same allele from mom or from dad. The dark blue segments are places where they got the same allele from mom and the same allele from dad. And the white segments are where they got different alleles from both mom and from dad. Now here's a diagram, the same sort of diagram, this time for cousins. And the dark blue bars show the identical segments between cousins. Here, as I said, we expect about 12.5% to be identical, and to a first approximation, that's about what we see. The question I want to raise is, what if these cousins were to marry and have a child? And I'm raising that as a question for you to answer. And I've put a pedigree diagram showing this hypothetical mating. And the double line just indicates that these two individuals are related. Question asks, assuming that they have the expected 12.5% identical segments, how much of the child's genome will be homozygous for alleles from both parents? The answer is we expect about 3% of each child's genome to be homozygous for alleles that are in their parents because their parents are cousins and inherited these alleles from one or another of their common ancestors. How do we get this number? Well, I'll show you. It's really quite easy to understand. There's the pedigree again. It's simplest to first think about it ignoring the relatedness and just go back to thinking about, well, if both parents carry the same recessive allele, so let's say that one parent is big A, 1 and little a, and the other parent is big A2, little a, the probability that the child will be homozygous for the little a allele is 1/4. And you can confirm that by drawing a mating square if it's not, by this point, obvious to you that that is the expectation. The only thing that's different is that, in fact, these parents are related, so we can predict how many of their alleles it will be the case where they both have the same allele from a common ancestor. And we know that it's 12.5%. So a quarter of 12.5% of their alleles will be homozygous in their child. So I'm going to introduce a new term. We have already considered relatedness. We introduced it in Module 7, and we used it a few lectures ago when we were finding ways to estimate heritability in humans. Relatedness is defined as the fraction of genes expected to be identical by descent between two individuals. So when you're thinking about parents, you should think about relatedness. The inbreeding coefficient is the fraction of alleles expected to be identical by descent, so far the same as this, in one individual. And this is what you should think about when you're thinking about offspring. And we can express mathematically the calculation that we just did. The probability that offspring will be homozygous for an allele, which is the inbreeding coefficient, is a quarter of the relatedness of the parents. That's the calculation we just did. Now, here's a pair of comparisons showing the actual identity by descent, this time not between cousins, but between second cousins. These are individuals whose parents were cousins. And what's striking about these two examples is how different they are. The pair A of second cousins has quite a few segments of identity, and they're fairly long. Pair B has much less identity. This is purely the result of chance effects in meiosis, and shows how dramatically predictions of relatedness can underestimate or overestimate the actual relatedness when you get out to relatively distant relatives. Now, a term that I haven't really introduced yet is consanguineous matings. I showed you the double line in the pedigree, meaning that the parents are related. The term for this in analysis of pedigrees is consanguineous matings. Consanguineous is a great big word that means shared blood. So these are blood relatives, as we used to say. And here I've just calculated the inbreeding coefficient for the child of consanguineous parents. If the parents are siblings, the inbreeding coefficient is 0.125. If the parents are cousins, the inbreeding coefficient is 0.031, which is what we calculated earlier. Now, the issue that we need to think about, what really matters in this analysis, is that offspring of matings between relatives are often homozygous for alleles that were present in a shared parent. Homozygous for an allele that was present in a shared parent. And most of the time, this is fine. Most of these alleles are identical, or they're neutral, they don't affect fitness, or they're alleles that are actually beneficial. All of these are possible. But some of the time, this homozygosity is going to be for harmful recessive alleles that were rare in the population, but were present in one of their ancestors. How big a problem is this? Well, we have good estimates now from genome sequencing. And that says that we each carry about 400 harmful alleles that are not expressed in us because they're heterozygous. These are relatively rare alleles. And it's expected that about 2 of these alleles, so we each carry about 2 alleles that would cause serious disease if they were homozygous. And this is then the reason why inbreeding between close relatives can create an increase, for instance, in birth defects, an increase in all kinds of genetic problems caused by harmful recessive alleles. It also can cause an increase in good things caused by beneficial recessive alleles, but of course we don't worry about that. So we've talked about the harm that can arise from inbreeding. First, talking about predicted relatedness and introducing two new concepts, that of blood relatives or consanguineous matings, and the inbreeding coefficient, the fraction of alleles in an offspring that are expected to be homozygous. And then we talked about, because some of these alleles will be harmful but recessive, then there are serious health consequences of inbreeding for families. Coming up next, we're going to focus on a particular population with a very high level of inbreeding, the Samaritans, and consider the problems that they suffered from inbreeding and the solution that they found. I hope to see you there.